our grandson is a member, so it couldn't be any better than having that place. It's where I got married to Wendy, that many of you remember. It's where I got to celebrate with my wife, Tony, in the naming of our grandson. It's a very special place. So 38 years ago, a green as grass assistant rabbi crossed Mount Eagle, leaving the Temple of Nashville, Tennessee, to come to the historic Ox Memorial Temple Mizpah congregation to become the 12th rabbi of Mizpah congregation and the 18th clergy leader, when you count the lay leadership and volunteer rabbis that have blessed the congregation over its 155 years. Now, in a nutshell, for those of you who are new and are wondering who this old Punim is on the screen right now, my career encompassed 2 congregational communities. That was Nashville and Chattanooga, 1 seminary as a student, and then as the dean and faculty member and director of the rabbinical school, and 1 organization, Roots of Reform Judaism, that I'm going to tell you about in a little while. All of these have certain values in common. And all of these are why I chose the title for this presentation on this Arab Shavuot, to talk about the historic panorama of the role Mizpah congregation has played in the history of American Reform Judaism. And I think it is fair to say, without Mizpah and without its leadership and without some of its lay and professional clergy, Reform Judaism as we know it today would not exist. So let's begin. 1866, a bunch of Jews got together after having come to Chattanooga, probably in 1858, and said, we need a congregation. And so they created the Hebrew Benevolent Society, which is interesting as a name, because in fact, that's the same name that the temple in Atlanta chose for its congregation pretty much around the same time. In 1882, and don't worry, it's not a history lesson, you can read all this stuff, but it's setting up what I hope will be a clear direction of why I'm going this way as we continue together. In 1882, as I began, the very first building for the congregation was completed at 429 Walnut Street, dedicated by no less than Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise and Julius Ox, son-in-law. It's fascinating to me that here is Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism, who had become the rabbi in Cincinnati in the 1850s after having been a rabbi in Albany, New York, and in 1873 founded the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and 2 years later, the Hebrew Union College. And a year after he got involved with the beginnings of the Walnut Street Temple for Congregation Micah, began the organization, Mizpah Congregation, began the founding of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So here is Wise coming down from Cincinnati to Chattanooga and dedicated the very first building. Now, why did he come? He had a lot of mishpacha in Chattanooga, and I'm sure they said, we want you here. And Wise was as peripatetic a traveler as you can imagine. He was everywhere, and he had a great connection to Chattanooga and to Mizpah congregation, then called the Hebrew Benevolent Association. Now, Wise said to them, that's not a very good name. You should change your name. And you're here on these mountains in the mountainous city of Chattanooga. Therefore, I think you should change your name to Mizpah Congregation, meaning on the heights, looking down at the people. But of course, congregation leadership followed the tradition it followed for many, many years. And I can speak, having been the rabbi for 10 of those years, that it took them approximately 6 years to change the name. Now, why did they change it? Because they had to write new bylaws anyway, so they figured they'd do it all together. And they changed the name to Mizpah Congregation at the same time that they changed the bylaws of the congregation going forward. Now, Mizpah had a very close connection with the Hebrew Union College, not only because so many of its rabbis were educated there, but the very first guest professorship at Mizpah congregation was Professor Dr. Herr Sigmund Mannheimer, one of the original 6 members of the HUC faculty that Wise had called together at the start of the school in 1875. And he was invited to Chattanooga in 1894 to conduct High Holy Day services. Now, it's fascinating to me that over the years, the faculty of HUC have been influential and really essential in the history of Mizpah congregation. And I mention that to you because it's the second of the pillars that are kind of the focus of my talk with all of us tonight. And that is the role of HUC at Mizpah and the role of Mizpah at HUC. Now, if we go forward with that, we look at another connection to Isaac Mayer Wise. And that is a name that all of you old timers will know very, very well. And that is Harry Wise. Harry Wise Sr., president of Mizpah congregation, excuse me, was asked to be, was asked to be the surrogate rabbi of the congregation for about 5 years when the congregation couldn't afford its own rabbi. They had been through 2 already. The congregation, as did the country, went through an economic downturn, and they couldn't afford a layperson, couldn't afford a professional as the rabbi, so they picked a layperson, and Harry Wise Sr. was their man. Harry Wise served the congregation for 50 years in different ways, as president, as this lay rabbi, as leader, as honorary president for the rest of his life. And as some of you will remember, those of you who are quite experienced in the history of Mizpah congregation, the social hall building was named for him, destroyed, torn down many years later as the building became impossible for the upkeep. In 1903, Mizpah finally joined Isaac Mayer Wise's primary organization, and that was the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Even though Mizpah had been around for pretty close to 40 years, they finally joined the congregation. And I think, imagine, some of it was the board being a little slow on wanting to add to the expense of membership, but recognizing that this was the movement for the future, founded by the late then Isaac Mayer Wise, who had died in 1900. And by the way, just to give you a sense of how important he was to the congregation, they raised the money amongst the community at Mizpah to pay for their rabbi to go to Cincinnati for Wise's funeral, which, by the way, was quite, don't take this disrespectfully, it was quite a shindig with apparently more than 1,000 people in attendance at that service, not only in the Plum Street Temple, but in where the service took place, but in the streets of Cincinnati out in front of Plum Street so that the people could be part of that experience. So here you have this remarkable family connection of Mizpah with the founder of Reform Judaism. Think of it this way. 1903, Mizpah joins the Union. Soon after that, their present rabbi at the time, Rabbi Leo Mannheimer, due to his illness, retires from the active rabbinic leadership of the congregation. And after that, who takes over? But yet another one of Isaac Mayer Wise's family members. And this, of course, is Jonah Wise, another of Wise's sons. Now, Mizpah congregation, when you recognize that the years of commitment of the Wise family to Mizpah is the longest and deepest and most profound of any family, of any congregation in the country, and think of from Isaac Mayer Wise there to dedicate the Walnut Street Temple, and then Harry Wise senior and junior. And then Jonah Wise, who went from Chattanooga on to great leadership of Central Synagogue in New York City, and all the way through our beloved and sorely missed Ruth Holmberg, the great granddaughter of Isaac Mayer Wise. There is no congregation that can claim the connection to the foundations of Reform Judaism more than Mizpah can, not even close. You've had 4 generations, actually 5 if you think about it, from Wise, his son, his grandsons, and great granddaughter. It is a remarkable connection of Mizpah in the foundations of not only Reform Judaism, but of the leadership of Reform Judaism. Because if you think of the 12 rabbis and the lay leadership who served at the community, some for just a few years, some for a decade, some like Rabbi Feinstein for 40 some years, these people went on to become leaders of congregations based on what they learned at Mizpah congregation. And it is indeed for that reason that it is so special to be part of this day with you this evening. And as I hope when Rabbi Lewis had the wisdom, as he always does, to invite you to stand up and stretch, I hope you did that, because there's still several wonderful presentations after this one. And this is sort of the hors d'oeuvre to get you to dinner time, so you can have a snack during the 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock lectures that are really very special indeed. So why is such a focus on HUC? Well, obviously, since Rabbi Jonah Wise, HUC has educated the rabbis who have served Mizpah congregation. I'm especially and deeply grateful that my HUC years encouraged 2 magnificent rabbis to come to Chattanooga, both favorite students of mine. Rabbi Bill Tepper, who was your rabbi from 2008 to 2016, and now my beloved friend and colleague and travel buddy and all sorts of great joys, Rabbi Craig Lewis, who, if you've ever met him, knows he's the puppeteer, he's a Disney fan. Don't mess with him on sports because he only has 2 teams he loves more than services themselves, and I'll leave that up to him to talk about. But you who have been in the Mizpah congregation world know how they inspire you with their talents, their gifts, their intellect, their vision, their ready smiles, their warmth and personality. In the times of tragedy, when our daughter was killed not so long ago, and the funeral took place at Mizpah, Craig was our rabbi, my rabbi, and is certainly someone whom I love and admire. And you are blessed to have him there as long as you can hold on to him, and to Jen and Eden and that whole family. So to them, it's a tribute. My tribute goes to them. And I am so grateful to have been a small part of Craig's and of Bill's studies at HUC, and grateful indeed to have been asked to be here today. So what did Reform teach when Mizpah congregation joined the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations? Well, I want to spend these next few minutes to talk about 3 pivotal documents. And I'm urging you, if you've never read them, to look them up, because they are sort of like the 2 pillars at the front of the Mizpah building. They're prophetic, as are those 2 columns. They represent great teachings of our people, as do those 2 columns, named for prophets, of course, but these were values. And they were called platforms. Now, when we hear the word platform, at least in the last year or 2, it doesn't mean something on which you run like a political campaign. The platforms we talk about, are you on Zoom platform? Are you on this kind of platform? But I'm going to talk now about the beliefs that were the underpinnings of Reform Judaism from its very earliest years in the 1880s, and then into the 1930s, and then most recently at the turn of the 21st century. And we're talking about the Pittsburgh Platform, which was written in 1885. Now, why am I going to give you an antique history lesson? Because if you want to know where Mizpah began and what it believed and what it stood for and why it was different than perhaps B'nai Zion or other community congregations, it is this first document written in November of 1885 and led by you-know-who, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, Chattanooga's own beloved patriarch of the rabbinical world. He got together with another great rabbi whose name was Kaufman Kohler, who at that time was in New York City, but went on to Chicago. And guess where he ended his career? As the president of the Hebrew Union College. These two great scholars gathered together about 13 years after the creation of the reform movement with the UAHC, and said, we now have enough rabbis. And when was the first rabbi ordained at HUC? 1883. And no, I was not in that class. But 1883, the first class of 4 people, it'll interest you, by the way, that the 5th person who ultimately was not ordained was a woman who would have been ordained in 1883. But her parents told her that women had no role in the rabbinate. That was a man's job. And while she was apparently, having studied her and read about her, the brightest person in the class, no surprise, she never finished all the way to ordination, although she did graduate. So she earned the scholarship, but never completed the moment of ordination when Wise stood there and put his hands on her shoulder as he did these other great rabbis in 1883. So 2 years later, there were about 10 ordained rabbis from HUC, but there were 30 or 40 more rabbis, most of whom had been ordained in Germany. And they gathered from all around the country in Pittsburgh, great Midwestern city with a sizable Jewish community, and of course, an extraordinarily powerful Reformed temple there as well. And they gathered to say, what is it that we think Reformed Judaism stands for? And here's what they said. And I could boil it down into 4 or 5 short points. But you know, no rabbi boils down into 5 minutes what he or she could say in 20 or 30. So I'll kind of go somewhere in the middle. First of all, they said that every religion grasps or attempts to grasp God. Only they referred to God as the infinite. And in every book or prayer book or source of revelation, there are sacred values of every indwelling of God in man and woman. And we hold, according to this document, and I'm reading from it in case you notice me looking down, that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea as taught in our holy scriptures and developed and spiritualized by the Jewish teachers, rabbis, in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective times. So look at the lesson that's so interesting here. Rabbi Lewis is a full 2 generations age-wise from me. And yet, both of us attempt to approach Judaism not only in the values of ancient times, but in the values of our day today. And the values he teaches, as beautiful and profound as they are certainly different than what I taught standing in the pulpit at Mizpah congregation. And yet, we both come from a place where the sources of what we learned was the same place. So here's the second thing, and this one, more controversial. We recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today we accept as binding, here's the point, only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So what are they saying? Yes, there's a Palestine. Remember, this is 1885. This is 63 years before the state of Israel. And they say, yes, there's a land called Palestine, but we are not Zionists. We are people who believe in the values and the values and the lessons that Palestine gives to us, but we reject those practices that are contrary to the views and habits of modern civilization. So what are they saying? Modernity would be more important than the traditions of Zionism and a Jewish homeland. Remember, 1885 is early period of historic Zionism with Theodor Herzl and the First Zionist Congress just being around the very same time. And so here is the Reform movement, German in its creation, which is interesting in itself, but saying to us or to the believers of the day that yes, there's a Palestine, but the practice of a Jewish homeland where we should leave the land of America and go to Palestine as our homeland, this is not what we believe. Now, if you want to get more controversial, listen to the next one. We hold, and I skipped one and I shouldn't. We will recognize in the Bible the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priests of monotheism of one God. And we value it as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction. We hold that modern discoveries of scientific researchers in the domain of nature and history are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism, that the Bible, reflecting the primitive ideas of its own ages and of its times, does not, clothing its conception of divine providence and justice, dealing with men and women in miraculous narratives. So what are they saying here? Yes, we believe in the Bible. Yes, it's a story of our Jewish people's history and our mission as the priest to God. But modernity and science are as much a part of our sacred lives as are the teachings of the primitive ideas, according to this text, of clothing its conception of divine providence and justice in miraculous narratives. Now, remember what modernity is in 1885, and we'll go on to the one that really got our colleagues in the Orthodox community upset. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinic law as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual self. They failed to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. Wow. You can imagine that these are the words of the radical reformers of this period of our history of the 1880s, specifically Kaufman and Kohler, and those who were supporters of his, because traditionally, Isaac Mayer Wise was thought of as a rather conservative, small c, rabbi, and was a follower of many halachic traditions, including the monotheistic belief of the inerrancy of God. And yet here was a statement that was saying that kashrut and wearing a yarmulke and wearing a talit and all those ritual items that were part of the belief of Judaism of the day, if you want to be modern, those things have to go. Number 5, we recognize in this modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect that the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment and kingdom of truth, justice, and peace that we no longer consider ourselves a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, meaning the priests, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. So think a minute while I take a sip of the iced tea. What is this statement saying? We don't look forward to a messianic hope of the Messiah, but rather a messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace. We do not consider ourselves a nation. We do not consider ourselves returning to Palestine as the Jewish homeland, nor to bring sacrifices by the sons of Aaron, in other words, the Kohanim, nor the restoration of any of the laws that concern the Jewish state. Now, I would imagine, were we present in the 1885 gathering in Pittsburgh, that most of the people there would have gone along with this statement, as radical as it was. But don't worry, our Reformed Judaism changes as each time, pretty close to 50 years from platform to platform, the positions change, as they certainly do now. Let me just complete the last one, although there's 7 points, but the 6th one is the most interesting of the 2 remaining. We reassert the doctrine of Judaism that the soul is immortal, grounding the belief on the divine nature of human spirit. We reject as ideas not rooted in Judaism the beliefs both in bodily resurrection and in heaven, hell and paradise, Gehenna and Eden, as abodes for everlasting punishment or reward. A very clear separation from the Orthodox tradition of the day. And it concludes the rest of that same statement, in accordance with the spirit of the Mosaic legislation, we deem it our duty to participate in the great task of modern times, to solve on the basis of justice and righteousness the problems presented by the contrasts and evils of the present organization of society. Now, I would say to you, if we took that text and modernized some of the language, that the message of social justice, the message of prophetic Judaism, would still be the ways that we direct our faith today. I don't think we would go as far as to reject the practice of different traditions of wearing a kippah or wearing a yarmulke, wearing a talit, or of keeping kosher for those who choose to do so. But those to the symbols of the writers of the Pittsburgh platform were simply saying those are symbols but not meanings. They're examples, they're not lessons that we adhere to. And it was a very powerful statement, which, as you can imagine, was sort of like yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. It absolutely angered Jews around the country, and at the same time galvanized the message for many other Jews who said, at last, we have found a voice that says what we believe in. In the effort of speaking to Christianity and Islam, whom the Pittsburgh platform refers to as daughter religions of Judaism, meaning part of the same community, that they could work together. Just think of the work that Rabbi Lewis is doing presently in interfaith work in the Chattanooga community. Look at the work that so many of the rabbis did in their careers at Mizpah. And I remember a rabbi beloved by so many of you who maybe grew up as children in the congregation at that time, but Abraham Feinstein, who was one of those people who, when he walked into Rotary, as we went to each week, the community's leaders, the leaders of every church, of every institution, of every business, would pay their respects to this man who meant so much as a voice of Judaism in a secular institutional setting as Rotary was, or being honored as he was in almost every possible way in the Chattanooga community. These lessons were the underpinning of what this congregation has taught, has inspired, and has represented in the greater Chattanooga community. It's one of the blessings that I had, having served as head of the Human Rights Commission in Hamilton County, and then again as the head of the Interfaith Association, of the Clergy Association, because those clergy who were part of it and those leaders of the civic community knew that I was the rabbi of the congregation that had marched and stood up for civil rights, for the values that they espoused, to work together. And where did those things come from? They came from those foundational values of the Pittsburgh platform. Now we're going to move forward. 50 years. And I'm sure you're saying, is he ever going to finish? Well, I'm not going to go into as great a detail, but I am going to share with you some changes, because unlike these grand inspirational or even aspirational messages that the rabbis of the 1885 gathered to do, in 1937, hundreds of rabbis gathered together, this time not in Pittsburgh, but in Columbus. And they came up with a much more specific document, not with grand ideas, but with specifics. They took values and names. They took great teachings and said, this document, unlike the previous one, which I think is safe to say was written for rabbis, this one was written for people. What are you going to teach in your sermons? What are you going to do to inspire the congregation of 1937? Remember that date. This is only 4 years after the beginning of Hitler as the lead chancellor in Germany. This is before the beginning of the war, only 2 years before. This is before the Holocaust, when in America there was a sense of great hope, a sense of opportunity, because the true events of Europe had really not gotten through to the community in America. And so they talked about principles, not just platforms. What does Judaism believe? And what they came up with were 3 great areas for us to understand. The first one is where Judaism began. The second one, what Judaism believes. And the third one, what Judaism does. And they didn't come up with these, we don't do this, we don't do that, we won't do this, we won't do that. They're saying, what do we do? And how do we live as Reformed Jews? And they talked about its foundations, the history we've just talked together about a few moments ago. But they boiled it down to 5 specifics that I share with you now. Number 1, what is the nature of Judaism? That partly it's historical. It began with the Jewish people, that its message is universal, not exclusivist, which certainly contrasted with other Jewish movements of the time. That it, like the name of the organization which gathered all the congregations together, is the union of American Hebrew congregations. It is a unity that brings us together. And God is the heart of Judaism. That's the second belief. Its chief contribution to religion in the world is the doctrine of the one living God, of monotheism, through a world of law and love. Now, why did they put that interesting phrase in? Because the Christian movements of the time, of which there was virulent anti-Semitism in the 1930s, were saying that Judaism is law and punishment and hate and justice and punishment, and Jesus and Christianity is the faith of love. Here's a statement saying, oh no, you can't remove love from the teachings of Judaism. Yes, it teaches law, the mitzvot, but the laws are based on love, not on punishment. That God is the existence of the creative source of humankind, and it's through transcending time and space. God is the indwelling presence of the world. So God not only is the judge and the arbiter and all those other things that we say in a few months at the High Holy Days, but in fact, that we worship God as the Lord of the universe and of the merciful parent. So it's both judge and loving parent together is what God is in the Judaism of that day. Then you move further, the word man. Now remember, this is before the sensitivity to gender language, so I'm sure they really meant humanity, but they used the word man. Judaism affirms that man is created in the divine image. Not Jews are created in the divine image, but all men and women. Humanity's spirit is immortal, that we are active co-workers with God. Again, both a reference to the uniqueness of Judaism and the difference in Christianity and other faith traditions. And as a child of God, all of us children of God, they are endowed with a moral freedom and charged with the responsibility of overcoming evil and striving for ideal ends. Now, if that's not aspirational, I don't know what is. It's not that we don't do stuff, we don't believe stuff, but this is what we have to try to aspire to be: overcoming evil and striving after the ideal ends that impact our lives. How tragic that 2-3 years from that moment, 2 years, the beginning of World War II in Europe, and then 1941 here in America, that these goals are so challenging and so difficult. Let me go further. The fourth one, Torah. God reveals himself not only in majesty and beauty and nature, but in the vision and moral striving of the human spirit. And where do you find that? You find that in Torah. That's why you go to Torah study each week with Rabbi Lewis. That's why you hear Torah read when it's read at services. It is because the people of Israel, through its prophets, through its sages, through its teachers of Torah, have achieved the unique insight of the religious truth of the Torah. Not just the Torah, the scroll that's held up at Hagbah or used at Simchat Torah or all through the year at Shabbat worship, but Torah with not just a capital T, but a small t, all of Jewish learning. Maybe that's the teachings of the Talmud and of the Mishnah and of Midrash Rabbah and so on. Maybe it's the teaching of a great rabbi like Rabbi Lewis or the other rabbis who have served the congregation. That's all Torah, and that is what inspires us. And that is what our faith tradition lifted up as a statement of its beliefs in this platform of 1937. Big change. Israel. Judaism is the soul of which Israel is the body. Here was the first statement in a publicly held belief that Judaism was a faith, but Israel was its homeland, and that Israel is the body. Now think about that. This is 1937. This is before the creation of the state. This is before so much of the history that kind of was the engine that drove the state. Now, granted, it's after the documents of early 20th century, at the beginning of political Zionism, and of the document that changed everything in terms of the state of Israel from the state of Palestine. We know all that happened, but this is before the world engine began to create the state. And here was a group of Reformed Jews who are saying, although we recognize in the group loyalty of Jews who become estranged from our religious tradition, it is still a bond that unites them with us. And we maintain that it is by religion and for its religion that the Jewish people has lived. And here's the last statement of that document, of that section. We regard it, Israel, as our historic task to cooperate with all men and women in the establishment of the kingdom of God, of universal brotherhood and sisterhood, justice, truth, and peace on earth. That is our messianic goal, not our Messiah, but the messianic goal. The second big section, ethics. What is it that we believe in? And it lists 4 areas. The same 4 you could list if I asked you to grab a pencil and do it right now. The same 4 that inspired every rabbi that has served the congregation. I remember as a very green, young senior rabbi coming to Chattanooga and having Rabbi Feinstein living next door. And every single night at 10 o'clock when I shouldn't have been working, but I was still in the office, and the phone would ring and he would say, "You want to come have a cup of tea with an old man?" And I said, "Of course." And I would go over and he would teach me another remarkable lesson of his rabbinate. You may not know this. He was the very first rabbi to leave JTS, the Conservative Rabbinical Seminary, and join HUC as a Reform rabbi, and leaving that tradition to our tradition when he was called to serve the congregation by the congregation itself and by Adolf S. Ox in particular, who no doubt had to pull a few strings at JTS in New York to get that switch to happen. But it did. And I love those stories as I respected and admired everything that Rabbi Feinstein taught me. He was a great teacher as well. But those lessons, the ethics that he taught, that Rabbi Lewis taught, that Rabbi Tepper taught, that all the way back Rabbi Parker taught, or Rabbi Wise, Jonah Wise taught, ethics, religion, social justice, and peace. Those prophetic voices have always been the pillar of what made Judaism Judaism, and they understood it in 1937, even before knowing the incredible, tragic, challenging, difficult times they were about to enter in just 2 years from that gathering in Columbus. The third section was religious practice.
Rabbi, I just wanted, we've got maybe a little less than 10 minutes before we need to wrap up. So
no problem.
Okay.
I got you. Rabbi Lewis loves telling me to hush because I certainly had to do that in class with his student and his colleagues. Let me do the last one.
I thought for sure I was going to get kicked out of your class a couple of times.
Never, not you. The last one was religious practice. And he said very simply, Jewish life is marked by consecration to these ideals of Judaism, and it calls for faithful participation in the life of Jewish community as it finds expression in home, synagogue, school, and all other agencies that enrich Jewish life and promote its welfare. And it goes through with some of the values that it should represent: practice, prayer, language, meaning Hebrew language, the language of faith and aspiration. It doesn't say Hebrew language, but the language of faith and aspiration, that it directs human hearts and minds Godward, inside to God, and to deepen the spiritual life of our people, we cultivate the traditional habit of communion with God through prayer in both home and synagogue. So it meant very simply that Jewish practice couldn't just be done in the synagogue and not at home. It was a combined effort. It was a combined place. And it ended with, we call upon our fellow Jews to rededicate themselves to these values and to harmony with all humankind, hopefully and courageously to continue Israel's eternal quest after God and God's kingdom. The third document, which I won't read, is the longest of these 3, but I urge you to look at it because it is the last one that has guided our people in this past, since 1999, last close to 20 years. The Pittsburgh platform, known as the Centennial Platform, was a gathering of rabbis in 1999. This one I did attend, not 1937 or 1885, in case some of you thought. But it was a recognition that it was a revival a reaffirmation and a redirection of the Reform movement. This time, interestingly, not just in those great and grand English words, but in Hebrew words as well. And so I recommend to you that you read them because I think you'll find it a fascinating document. Now, Rabbi Lewis was great enough to ask me to speak today, not just as an old timer who preceded him by several decades at Mizpah congregation and who so much loves those 10 years that I had with all of you, but I took on a new challenge a couple of years ago when my position as director of the Rabbinical School and associate dean was eliminated from all of the different campuses of HUC, the New York, LA, and Cincinnati campuses. I was immediately approached by an organization called the Society for Classical Reform Judaism, which had been created about 10 or 12 years earlier to basically foster the continued use and the greater use of the Union Prayer Book, which congregations had used since the very beginning of the very end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, which Mizpah used, of course, in its earlier time. Interestingly, in the 1890s, they rejected the prayer book that they had used before, written by whom? Isaac Mayer Wise, and went on to his great competitor prayer book called the Union Prayer Book. And those of you old enough to remember, and it's probably in storage somewhere in the library, are some copies of the little blue book with the red ribbon that was the Union Prayer Book, the national prayer book of Reform Judaism from 1896 into the 1960s. And this prayer book has beautiful prayers with which you are familiar because we use them still, whether it's in Mishkan or in the gates of red or gates of blue. You can learn all about the early prayers. May the time not be distant, O God, when your name shall be worshiped in all. You remember that. Or grant us peace, thy most precious gift, O thou eternal source of peace. Well, where did that come from? That came from the Union Prayer Book of the 1890s, 1896, 1897. So I went into this organization saying to them, you know, I would be honored to be the interim director for a few months until you found someone, until you are willing to say, we need to change some things. We need to recognize that we can't be a society of classical reform because the name doesn't mean anything to a lot of people. And society sounds rather patronizing, I guess you would say. I said to them, if you'll change the name to Roots of Reform Judaism and broaden the vision that it would be a source of speaking out to the values of early reform, the great underpinnings and pillars of our tradition, that we could be a voice for so many people, including Mizpah congregation. And let me say to you that I can't say to anywhere else really, my goal was to hope that we could create in worship in other places the kind of worship experience that I had the privilege of participating in Chattanooga, and that you have the privilege to participate in now in Rabbi Lewis's services. I grant there's more English in my service than there is in Craig's because things have changed. But the fact is that Mizpah congregation absolutely changed the voice of this organization. So what are some of the things that we do? Well, first of all, look at this name, Roots of Reform Judaism. And if you want to look it up online or see the Shabbat services or High Holy Day services that I lead with a magnificent choir of 25 singers and 2 cantorial soloists, it's one word, rootsofreform.org. Look it up. But one of the things that we've done has been to create not a replacement for Mishkan or any of the other worship that we do and love so much, but in these 7 booklets with 2 more coming out, we have created a Time To series. One is a time to pray and for comfort in the hospital, a time to mourn, a time to reflect on Shabbat, a time to rejoice at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for those who are shut-ins or for those who are looking forward to that kind of experience of the language of the Union Prayer Book, but in the voice of our day today. This might be a a fun addition to the beautiful and meaningful services that Rabbi Lewis leads each time he gathers together, whether it's in the beautiful sanctuary in Feinstein Hall. I want to conclude with these last words, that on Mitzvah's Macaulay Avenue front doors are the words found carved in marble with which I conclude this Erev Shavuot with you today. I believe firmly and strongly in a supreme being, the ruler of heaven and earth. God cannot be confined within the limits of a synagogue or a temple or a cathedral, be it ever so lofty. Worship God, not alone by forms or ceremonies, but also by a virtuous life, by the practice of tzedakah, of charity, and of benevolence. This is my religion. And I would say even in 2021, this is our religion as well. Without Mizpah congregation, there would not be reform. And without reform, there would not be Mizpah congregation. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Amen. Yasher Koach. And I want to say thank you, Ken, Rabbi Kanter. And I still run into people all the time. I meet them and they go, "Oh, do you remember Rabbi Ken Kanter?" And I have to say, of course, I remember Rabbi Ken Kanter. He's my friend. He's my teacher. But your name and your shadow looms large, but it's a great shadow to be in. And I know you felt the same way with Rabbi Feinstein. I hope that one day some future rabbi at Mitzpah congregation has to walk in my shadow, and I'll know that's the mark of a great rabbinic career.
I guarantee that will happen.
We are inheritors of great tradition, and I appreciate the tradition that you've helped hand off to me. So thank you, Chag Sameach. We will take a short break, but I know that I think our speakers are both in the room now, and we'll continue with a life in legislative action, and with Suzanne Saxman Grooms and Jed Mescon. All right. You're welcome to stick around, Ken. Love to have you hang out. Feel free to schmooze.
Yes, so Rabbi, good to see you, Rabbi.
Hello, everybody. It's such a joy to see Jed coming in after me and seeing your distinguished speaker, who's the daughter of someone I worked with so closely and was a little girl when I was in the congregation, and to see a lot of familiar faces who've been part of my rabbinate for all these years. It's really special to be part of this today. And Craig, I'm so grateful for the privilege of being with you today, because I think what I learned at Mizpah, not just from Rabbi Feinstein, but Rabbi Goldman, and mostly from the lay leadership, impacted me completely for the rest of my rabbinic career. And you heard about it, a lot of it in senior seminar.
All right, so what's going on in Cincinnati?
It's a beautiful sunny day for a change, and we miss you very much. Skyline Chili misses you.
No, I didn't go there much.
I know, but that's why I missed you. And
Graders.
Graders doesn't miss anybody. They do just fine without any of us as customers. But it's great ordination, which was socially distanced. There were only allowed 4 people, and it was inside a tent. Took place last weekend.
Let it go.
So it's been quite a year for the school, and I know you've done some beautiful services online. It's been great.
Doing our best.
Yeah, for sure.
Looking forward to being back in the sanctuary, which, God willing, if the creek don't rise, will happen soon.
That's great. Well, thank you for this opportunity. And for everybody watching, thank you as well. I guess I didn't give much time for questions, but
they know where to find you.
Right, for sure.